Good morning. I'm Jonathan Capehart, opinion writer for the Washington Post. Welcome to First Look, Washington Post Live's one-stop shop for news and analysis. And we're starting this Friday off with Paige Winfield Cunningham, health policy reporter and author of the Health 202 newsletter here at the Washington Post. Paige, welcome to First Look.
Good morning, Jonathan.
So yesterday, a total of 100 million people had received at least their first dose of a coronavirus vaccine. But earlier this week, the CDC director went off script and talked about how she was afraid of and warned of, quote, impending doom about the virus. What do we know about the trajectory of case numbers right now?
Yes, well, so what we know is that cases are well below, what they were over the winter. We saw a peak of about a quarter of a million cases every day in January. Now we're down to less than 70,000, which is great news. But I think the concern that the CDC is outlining here is that as people get out and about more, as more people get vaccines, we're seeing confidence increase and sort of fear of the virus go away, which is good in one sense, but also you're seeing the number of cases start inching up again. And so I think that's why you saw her the concern that she expressed. Now, I think the question here is what's going to happen with hospitalizations and deaths, because the administration has also announced that more than half of all seniors have received the vaccine at this point. And of course, those are the folks most likely to have serious disease or die from the virus. So the question I have and what I'm going to be watching, and what I think a lot of epidemiologists are going to be watching, is are we going to see that rise in deaths, which usually comes about 3 weeks or 4 weeks after we see the rise in cases? Are we going to see that happen again? Or there's the hope possibly that that could be less now that we do have many in the most vulnerable categories vaccinated.
Okay, so that's a good thing to watch out for. The one thing you didn't mention is concern about variants and how those variants could be driving these new cases, and also whether the vaccines that people are getting are even effective. So, what can you tell us about that?
Right. This has been a huge kind of point of dispute among epidemiologists. You talk to one epidemiologist, and they think the variants are going to be this huge game changer and really damaging, even as we get people vaccinated. Because you're right, we haven't actually, most of the vaccines have not been tested with the variants. A few have, most of the ones we're using in the US haven't. And you're right, we are seeing this variant that was first spotted in the UK spread in the US. So there are those that are very concerned about this, but then there are other epidemiologists who don't feel like there's huge cause for concern and that we're still going to see effectiveness in the vaccines potentially against these variants. So I think it remains to be seen. But I think the good news right now, at least, is that we aren't seeing the hospitalizations and deaths up yet. Although again, I would reiterate, it's probably too soon to actually know for sure what's going to happen with that.
And Paige, do you know if the Biden administration is reassessing the path forward given the rise in cases?
I don't know that we have indication of that yet. What we've seen from President Biden is a lot of confidence. He gave that speech last week or the week before saying that we're going to have wide availability. And, that's significant, of course, coming from this president who, in contrast to the last president, is not one to overpromise. I do think the administration is rethinking some small parts of its strategy in terms of distributing the vaccines. For example, one of the things that's invested heavily in is these mass vaccination sites in stadiums and other places, and has invested a lot in setting those up in some major cities over the last month or two. We haven't actually seen those places distribute the vaccines as rapidly as I think the administration was hoping. So I think what we may see is more of a shift toward focusing on, distribution by local pharmacies.
Hmm. Uh-oh. Paige?
Mobile clinics out.
There you go. Sorry, Paige, about that. You froze there for a little bit. But speaking of vaccines and vaccine distribution strategy, you were leading to something that was going to be my follow-up question, and that is this. The White House allocates vaccines based on population. But we saw this week Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer ask the administration to consider rushing more vaccine to hard hit parts of the country, like her state, like Michigan. and she was rebuffed. So, what does that say about the president's strategy? Is the administration willing to adjust so that hard hit places like Michigan can get more vaccine?
Right. That's a great question. And of course, the administration has really focused on equity and trying to get the vaccine to the most vulnerable. This question of how to allocate the vaccine was one that was hotly debated back in December when we were figuring out how to get it out. And there was some thought of
Paige is frozen again. The last time I started talking, she popped back. There you are, Paige.
I'm so
Start your
sorry.
answer again. No, that's okay. Start your answer again. Sorry about that.
Yeah, well, this is an interesting debate because there was a lot of debate over whether to do it by a very simple metric to get to the states just based on population versus the vulnerability of citizens. And there was a decision made to go just by population, just for the purpose of getting the vaccine out quickly. So I think it's a question. I'm not sure how the Biden administration is going to respond to this. They have said over and over again that equity and trying to reach the most vulnerable communities is going to be a high priority for them. One thing they have been trying to do is send out these mobile clinics to these most vulnerable communities, and they've talked about that again and again. So I'll be watching to see how they respond to this request over the next few weeks.
Paige, there's something interesting here. Why is the Biden administration trying to cover as many of the 29 million uninsured Americans as it can through Obamacare? What's the play here?
Well, this goes to something President Biden, of course, talked about during the campaign over and over, which is go through existing channels to get this population covered. And what I think a lot of people don't recognize is that we already have mechanisms here in the US to cover about half of the uninsured population. That's through Medicaid and through subsidies on the marketplaces. President Biden is really somebody who wants to work through these existing channels. And so I think they saw an opportunity in the coronavirus relief bill to expand these subsidies, both for people at the upper end of the income level and income and lower levels, and really try to kind of chip away at this large, persistent, uninsured population. So they've opened up enrollment in healthcare.gov. Now it's going to be extended through August. And I think what the administration is really going to be pushing for is trying to make these subsidy expansions permanent. Right now, they will expire after just 2 years. So I think the next big push of the administration is try to make these permanent so that people have access to more both people have more access to more generous subsidies, and also just more people have access to the subsidies.
And isn't the part of the play here also in the middle of a pandemic that we're still trying to get a handle on? Getting people insured is a good way to also stem the tide of the pandemic, right?
Well, absolutely. And it's easier than ever to make that case because we have a long problem in our country with pre-existing conditions, with obesity, with heart disease, with diabetes, things like that. And study after study has shown that it's extremely hard to chip away at these issues if people do not have health insurance and don't have a way to get that preventive care. And so I think the administration has really seized that opportunity, saying the pandemic has highlighted these health problems, these disparities that we have in the US, and sort of use that to make the case for why we need to provide an opportunity for people to get affordable coverage.
So let's talk about kids because this week Pfizer announced that its coronavirus vaccine was safe and efficacious in adolescents as young as 12. So, how critical is it for kids to be vaccinated? And what does that signal for the timeline on children getting back to school?
Well, it's certainly good news, of course, that this is seeming to work really well in kids. And actually, it looked like kids developed antibodies even more than young adults did. So that's great news. The administration has said over and over getting kids vaccinated is not something that needs to happen before kids go back to the classroom. And we've seen growing evidence that kids really aren't spreading the virus in the classrooms to a large degree. In fact, some epidemiologists are now actually questioning the decision of a lot of folks to close the schools in some of these larger cities, considering that we haven't seen that transmission in the schools that did reopen. And so that's one thing to keep in mind, even as we see these vaccine efforts for kids going ahead. I don't think there's any reason why schools shouldn't be able to open in the fall. That said, Pfizer is now saying that they're going ahead and try to get approval for use in kids, and we could see some kids getting vaccinated before they go back to the classroom. This could also be really good timing because kids tend to get their routine vaccinations. If they go to, a well kid checkup before they go back to school, you could roll the coronavirus vaccines into that, and certainly can give families, more confidence going forward. If the parents are vaccinated, the kids are vaccinated, that they can really go back to normal life. So it's great news, but I do think, we've heard over and over from the administration as they've tried to get the schools open and put pressure on schools to open. That shouldn't be a criteria for kids going back to the classroom this fall.
So throughout this entire discussion, I've been thinking about something President Biden said. I guess it was towards the very beginning of his term, and that was that he had hoped that by the 4th of July, we would not only be celebrating the independence of America, but we would also be celebrating our independence from the virus. Given the rise in cases, is that still possible from your reporting?
Well, when you look at the rise of cases again, it's inching up there. It is still well below, well below what we saw this winter. And again, we don't know exactly what's going to happen with deaths and hospitalizations. I will say there's very encouraging news when you look at the rate of vaccinations per day. We are now very close to 3 million shots being administered per day. And so when you think about that rate compared to the number of people we now have vaccinated, I mean, we actually, if you look at the adult population of the US, we have almost 40% of adults with one shot or both shots. So if you combine that with this rate, and assuming it hopefully keeps ramping up, it seems reasonable to think that we could be close to majority, or well over a majority, and even possibly to herd immunity among the adult population being vaccinated at some point this summer. So when you look at sort of the raw numbers of the vaccinations and sort of the success of the rollout, I think it's fair for the president to still, be encouraging to Americans that, that the holiday could actually look very celebratory.
And with that, not only are we out of time, Paige, we've run overtime. So I really appreciate your coming to First Look and sharing with us all that news from your reporting about the coronavirus and vaccinations. Thank you very much for coming to First Look. Have a good weekend.
You too. Thanks.
And now let's go to the opinion side of the Washington Post, where we will find Deputy Editorial Page Editor Ruth Marcus, and we will eventually be joined by Washington Post opinions columnist Hugh Hewitt. But Ruth, that just means that you and I can really talk.
We have to start with Bow Tie Friday.
Right. Well, I did it because it was just easier than trying to figure out what tie to wear with this ensemble. But you know what? Let's start with the big news.
Yeah, this is my ensemble.
Who knew this turned into Fashion Week on Washington Post Live? But there's some really good news.
Well, I mean, half Fashion Week, not me.
So there's some really good news, economic news that hit just before we came online here. 916,000 jobs added in March. Unemployment rate has fallen to 6%. Will this have any kind of impact on what President Biden is trying to do in terms of getting things back on track, particularly now that he is a day out from having announced his American Jobs Plan Act?
Well, first of all, it's fantastic news. It's wonderful news. We've suffered, and many people, especially lower down on the economic spectrum, have suffered in particular because of the economic impact of the coronavirus, which is it's really important to remember how unequally it's been distributed. While people who have investments in the stock market have prospered, while people who have jobs that can be conducted remotely have continued to be employed. There's been so much suffering. Much of it has been alleviated through the packages, not just the one that was most recently passed by President Biden and the Democratic Congress, but the previous ones. This is the beginning, I think, of really, really good economic news. The country, despite some of the concerns that you and Paige were discussing with the persistence of the virus and variants, is reopening. It is coming back. There's an enormous amount of money that has been and will continue to be pumped into the economy over the next year that is going to increase economic growth, and support the people who need it, hopefully without creating inflation that could diminish the spending power of the people who need spending
Hmm.
power. But this is the beginning of what should be a really robust recovery. There's a separate question that you asked about whether it's going to help President Biden as he pushes the second and equally, if not more bold round of his legislative proposals, which is infrastructure spending writ large for the longer term, not just over a year, but over 8 years. I think it will help them in the sense of a public that is happy with the economy, is happy, whether it's fair or not, with the president who they understand to be overseeing the economy. I think it's still going to be very, very, very difficult for the president to achieve the kind of bipartisan support he says he wants for the infrastructure package.
Ruth, do you think, okay, can we start on the bipartisan piece here? Because I don't expect any of the Senate Republicans to support this bill either now or as it winds its way through the committee process and ends up coming to the floor for a vote. So what is the path to get this passed with no Republican support? Is there
So
one?
I think we've seen this path before and we know what it is. And I agree with you. The prospect of getting Republican support, A, for a package this large and this ambitious, but B, is even bigger, for a package which is proposed to be paid for by undoing some, just some, by the way, of the Trump 2017 tax cuts, is really a Republican non starter. So the imagined capacity to get Republican support for the pandemic relief American Rescue Plan was at least arguable for a bit, worth testing the
Hmm.
water. It's the prospect of bipartisanship seems dead on arrival here. But we know what the path is. It's going to be a harder path than we saw the last time. The path is through the device called reconciliation, as all viewers of Washington Post Live know. You
Yep.
can reconciliation to achieve certain but not all goals. They have to be basically have a budgetary effect without having to get 60 votes. You can do them by majority vote. That means all 50 Democrats and Vice President Kamala Harris casting the deciding vote. But the most important words I said there for the prospect of this infrastructure package is all 50 Democratic votes. And that is going to be President Biden's biggest challenge going forward. It's going to be to get two things simultaneously to make sure he doesn't lose any senators or House members on the left hand side of the party who are arguing that this package isn't big enough or radical enough or doesn't include some things that they want. Um, and but even more important for Senate purposes, to make sure that moderate Democrats like Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, Senator Kirsten Sinema of Arizona remain on board because there is no vote to spare.
So apparently, we're about to find out from the Senate parliamentarian whether reconciliation can be used for the American Jobs Act, possibly today. So we will have an indication as to whether the AJA, as I'm going to start calling it, can be passed by a simple majority vote through reconciliation. If not, then it's going to be real fun to watch. Excuse me,
We're not fun to
allergies.
watch at all because it's not going to go anywhere.
Well, that's true, and I hate to laugh at that, but it's just the political reality that we face. But let's talk about the pay-fors here. And you were talking about them in your earlier answer, and that is raising taxes on corporations, sort of clawing back some of the Trump tax cuts from the last term. You're not such a fan of that, if I recall, right?
No, I am, and I'm
Oh,
really
you are.
sorry
Okay.
not here yet because I really want to get into a good fight with him about these corporate tax cuts. let's review the bidding here. So when President Trump took office, the corporate tax rate was at 35%. And much of the discussion involved the importance, or so it was argued, of lowering that corporate tax rate in order to, and I'm going to keep saying, or so it was argued, in order to increase corporate productivity. This would trickle down to creating jobs and lift the economy as a whole. Uh, During that conversation about lowering the corporate tax rate, various rates were proposed, and one of them was 28%. Keep that number in mind, because that,
Hmm.
at the time that it was 35, seemed like a pretty significant shift and a good offer. In the end, President Trump had control of the Congress. The corporate tax rate was lowered to an astonishingly low, historically low, 21%. What happened then? Did the promised economic boom, the promised, or at least uh, rumored or hinted at, pay for itself of the tax cuts through increased economic productivity and therefore increased revenue come to pass? No, it did not. The tax cut was a bad, reckless idea to start with. That's the Trump
Right.
tax. President Biden is not proposing raising it back to 35%. He's proposing raising it back to 28%, which once was um, acceptable to corporate America and is not. But it's really important that we not dig the debt hole even more enormously by failing to pay for important investments. So asking corporate America to pay for some of the investments that will help them transport their goods and have their workers have childcare and everything else, have their workers have broadband so they can work remotely, seems like a perfectly reasonable ask. And so uh, I really like Republicans to explain to us why we should listen to their fears and their warnings that this will destroy corporate productivity and destroy the economy, when their promises about how this would help corporate productivity and help the economy didn't pan out.
I want to ask you one more question on this, and then we must talk about the Derek Chauvin trial. But maybe you have a quibble with our colleague Catherine Rampell, who on today's op-ed page has a column that says the court raising the corporate taxes. I mean, that's fine, but if you really want to pay for this, you're really going to have to ask more people to have skin in the game. You're going to have to ask the middle class and more Americans to pay for this. What do you make of Catherine's argument?
So I think there's a really interesting question about how much of America should be asked to pay for some of the benefits that we are giving to people who are in need, and how much of America should be asked to pay for the improvements we're making in society as a whole. I don't disagree with Catherine that in the end, because remember, this is part two. This infrastructure plan we've seen is part two of three. The next thing that's coming is an ambitious plan to provide and finance all sorts of other benefits. And that is to be paid for through, and this is where Catherine's issue comes up, through increasing tax rates on the wealthy. And by wealthy, the president has said during the campaign that he won't increase taxes on anyone making less than $400,000 a year. This boxes him in, as Kathy said, because it prevents doing things that might be smart, like raising the gasoline tax, which hasn't been raised for decades. So we can tax people who are both polluting the economy and driving many miles on the infrastructure that we're building for them. So I think in the end, we're going to have a serious conversation about whether we need to think about asking more from people who earn less than $400,000 a year. But before we get to that point, let's talk about people who earn more than that, and companies that have benefited from what is going to be a booming economy, and make sure we get enough from them before we get to the next step.
So, in the time that we have left, and given that you are also, in addition to being a journalist, you are also a lawyer, and a journalist lawyer who has been watching the Derek Chauvin trial, from what I understand, as obsessively as I have been. And so I would love your assessment of how the prosecution is arguing its case and how the defense is doing in terms of rebutting what the prosecution is arguing.
I think the prosecution has had an extremely powerful and effective first week of testimony. It has achieved a number of things. First of all, it's portrayed George Floyd as a human being, a human being with flaws, but a human being who loved and was loved by other people. And so you want a jury to be able to identify with the victim in the case and not have him understood to be a sort of threatening, angry black man. And I have to put in the racial element because some of our colleagues have been writing about that very powerfully.
Hmm.
Piece by Gene Robinson in the paper today,
Yes, today is
um,
incredible.
and online, and that had to be, the officers. Officer Chauvin is white. George Floyd is black. There's an inevitable, if unstated, racial element going on here.
Can't be
So
separated. Yeah.
the the testimony yesterday from George Floyd's girlfriend, crying on the stand, talked about their relationship. I thought went very far way to humanizing him. So that's number one. Number two is the prosecution has done a remarkable job of showing how and why so many people, bystanders in this crowd, were upset by, and upset that isn't even a strong enough word, the behavior of Officer Chauvin, not just at the start of putting his knee on George Floyd's neck, but continuing for what we now know to be 9 minutes and 29 seconds. And there, the testimony of the paramedic, firefighter, EMT, who begged to be allowed to help George Floyd, was also extremely powerful. And so you just have this picture complete with video after video after video of people who are traumatized by their inability to help George Floyd. And it just begs the question of how this could have happened. Today, I believe we're going to get the testimony from the Minneapolis police chief, talking about how this is not consistent with what his officers, I think it's male, but excuse me if I'm being
Hmm.
gendered here, about what police officers should do. The defense, how's it doing? It has a very, very hard job. It's got an irrefutable videotape of Chauvin with his knee on the neck and his hands in his pocket and ignoring the entreaties of the crowd. They're trying to paint a picture that the officer was somehow distracted by the crowd. That seems hard to take. They're trying to paint a picture, kind of laying the groundwork for a picture that George Floyd was so out of control and so hepped up on the medication or drugs, prescription drugs that he was taking, that they needed to take these extreme measures. But this is I actually feel some empathy. I know this is going to alarm some people for the defense because they were just given a very, very, very weak hand to play. And I'm not sure they're playing it in the strongest way, but they really have a weak hand. Uh,
I mean, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Ruth.
just, just a really strong, as powerful a week for the prosecution as I could have imagined.
Yes, and I'm glad to hear you say that because I'm not a lawyer, and just watching, that's sort of the conclusion I came to. And I understand, what you said about the defense. And look, Derek Chauvin is, he deserves a defense, and the best defense that he can find. The thing that I have a problem with is the defense relying on racist tropes to defend his client. When he had Mr. Williams on the stand in cross-examination, were you angry? So were you angry? Trying to get this black man to say that he was angry, and having that black man say to him, "You're not going to get me to say I'm angry." Courtney Ross, the George Floyd's girlfriend, I agree with you. She, in ways I didn't even think were possible, made him not just a real person, but somebody who was totally alive in her life. And I remember tweeting out that this, not only did she, like, she loved George Floyd, you could see that she still loves him and misses him. It came right through the camera for me. And then the other thing we didn't talk about is the fact that his Derek Chauvin's supervisor testified yesterday that he didn't learn about Chauvin's knee on George Floyd's neck until way after the incident. And if I remember reading right in the paper today, it wasn't until until the woman, the first witness who testified about watching what was happening on the screen from afar and then reporting and saying, I don't want to be a snitch, but something's not right here. And that's right. It was the 911 operator, the omniscient producer, jumped in my ear and told me. There's a lot going on in this case, and I wonder, Ruth, actually we're over time, but I want to get your answer to this question. Given everything that we've heard this
Would be wise. I was thinking about this morning because I thought you might ask. It would be a real Hail Mary move by the defense, concluding that they've got nothing left to lose. But imagine Derek Chauvin on the stand. Play that 9 minutes and 29 seconds very slowly, interrupt it at each point and say, what were you thinking when this person yelled at you? He pick your knee up. What were you thinking when this person said he doesn't have a pulse? Why was your knee still on the neck then? Why was your knee still on the neck then? Why didn't you let the EMT in? Why didn't you take your knee off the neck when the ambulance arrived and tried to revive him until they asked you to move it? I just think it's insupportable for him to take the stand, but I think he's in a bad state anyway. But I really highly doubt that we'll see it.
Well, Ruth, like with Paige, not only are we out of time, we are over time. Thank you very much for hanging in there. We missed Hugh. Hugh, we hope everything is okay, and we will see him next time. But Ruth Marcus, Deputy Editorial Page Editor of the Washington Post, thank you very much, as always, for coming to First Look.
Thanks, Jonathan. Miss you, Hugh.
And thank you, as always, for tuning in and for putting up with my froggy throat there. Join me tonight for Brooks and Capehart on the PBS NewsHour. Check your local listings. And then join me on Sunday on MSNBC for the Sunday show on MSNBC. Once again, I'm Jonathan Capehart, opinion writer for the Washington Post. Thank you so much for tuning in to Washington Post Live's First Look, and happy Easter.